Chapter 1. The Grave with a Beating Heart. It was on one of those damp and wind-stirred evenings in late October that the singular affair of the Chislehurst grave came to our attention. London had been swathed all day in a low yellow fog, through which the gas lamps burned like dim orange moons, and by nightfall a fine drizzle had begun to patter against our sitting-room windows in Baker Street. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, the tips of his long fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed in a meditative repose which I had come to know often concealed an active and penetrating alertness. I was engaged in jotting down some notes upon a recent and comparatively mundane case of petty forgery, when Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her salver. Holmes glanced at it, and for an instant his eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he said. Our visitor, a man of about 50 with a pallid face drawn tight over prominent cheekbones, entered with the air of one who carries an intolerable burden. His black coat and cravat, though of good quality, were slightly disheveled, and there clung about him an odor of wet earth and faded flowers, such as one encounters in a churchyard after rain. He inclined his head briefly to me before turning to Holmes. "My name is Reverend Elias Fortescue," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "I am vicar of St. Stephen's in Chislehurst. I would not trouble you, sir, but I am confronted with a matter both unnatural and deeply distressing." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray take the chair by the fire. You are chilled. Now, Reverend, you have come through the fog to speak to me of something unnatural. In what manner?" The clergyman's eyes flickered towards me, then back to Holmes. "It concerns a burial which took place 6 days ago. A gentleman of some local standing, Mr. Nathaniel Arkwright, retired from the colonial service, was laid to rest in our churchyard. The interment was conducted without incident, and the grave sealed. 2 nights past, however, the sexton, whose cottage overlooks the ground, swore that he heard sounds issuing from within the earth." "Sounds?" I echoed before I could prevent myself. "A rhythmic, muffled thudding," the Reverend said gravely. "Like the beating of a heart." Holmes' eyes opened fully now, and a faint gleam came into them. "You are certain, Reverend, that your sexton was sober?" "Caleb Barnes has served the parish for 40 years, Fortescue said stiffly. "I have never known him to invent tales. He is, however, deeply shaken. Yesterday at dawn, he approached the grave and found the soil disturbed, only slightly as if from beneath, and a withered rose from the funeral wreath pressed upright into the earth, where none had been before. I laid down my pen, a shiver running along my spine despite the fire's warmth." Holmes, however, had assumed that curiously impersonal expression which to the uninitiated might appear detached, but which I knew signified intense concentration. "And what was done?" Holmes asked. "Nothing save to keep watch last night. Barnes reported the sound again, weaker than before. He fears. Well, you may imagine what tales spread among the village folk. I have done my best to quell them, but certain parishioners insist that the grave be opened, while others declare such an act to be sacrilege. I do not know which course is right, or safe." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Arkwright, you say, was retired from the colonial service. When did he return to England?" 5 months ago, Fortescue replied. He had been living alone at a small estate, Hawthorne Lodge, on the edge of the village. No close family, only a nephew, Leonard Arkwright, who arrived for the funeral. Holmes glanced at me, and I noted the brief glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. "And Mr. Arkwright's cause of death?" "Apoplexy, according to Dr. Phelps, the local surgeon. He was found seated in his study, quite dead." Holmes rose and moved to the hearth, his shadow cast tall against the wall. "Reverend, your parish is laboring under an impression of something impossible, that a man long buried is alive beneath the soil. Such impressions can be exploited. Before we permit the matter to become the talk of the countryside, we must ascertain whether the disturbance is a fraud, a delusion, or something yet more singular." Fortescue leaned forward. "Then you will come to Chislehurst?" Holmes' smile was almost imperceptible. "Dr. Watson and I will accompany you on the morning train. I advise you, meanwhile, to say nothing of your visit here. Let the ground be watched but not touched, until I have seen it with my own eyes." As our visitor took his leave, the wind rattled the panes, and the thin rain streaked the gaslit windows. I could not help but voice the unease that had been stirring within me since the Reverend's tale began. "Holmes," I said, "surely you do not believe?" "My dear Watson," he interrupted gently, "I believe nothing until I have data. But I observe that a withered rose, placed upright in disturbed soil, is a singularly deliberate act. And deliberate acts, in connection with graves, are rarely without design." He seated himself once more, his gaze far away, and the firelight glinted in his eyes as though it reflected some inner illumination. I knew then, with the certainty that comes of long acquaintance, that the morrow's journey would lead us into one of those curious entanglements which only Holmes could unravel, where the line between the explicable and the uncanny lay finer than the edge of a surgeon's blade. Would you like me to continue directly into Chapter 2, Holmes and Watson's first discussion, so the pacing and atmosphere carry smoothly forward? Chapter 2, Holmes and Watson's first discussion. I confess that Reverend Fortescue's tale lingered with me long after the vicar had vanished into the murk of Baker Street. The steady hiss of the rain against the panes and the low breathing of the fire combined with the thought of that sodden churchyard until I found myself, more than once, glancing at the clock and listening, as if, in the silence that follows midnight, I too might hear a faint, buried thudding. Holmes, for his part, betrayed no such disquiet. He smoked in reflective contentment, the blue spirals of his cigarette drifting like a curtain through which his lean, aquiline profile came and went. At last I retired, and when I descended in the grey hush of the morning, I found him already at the breakfast table, his cup half emptied and the inevitable mound of correspondence thrust aside in favor of a single sheet, which he examined with a small lens. "Good morning, Watson," said he. "A raw day for graves and therefore an admirable one for the living. You slept badly." "I fear I did," I admitted. "The vicar's story?" "The human imagination," he interposed lightly, "is a horse that gallops most furiously in fog. You will fortify yourself with coffee. We take the 9.25 to Chislehurst." He tapped the sheet beside him with a finger. "Meanwhile, permit me a small diversion. Consider this letter. It contains nothing of moment, merely a tradesman's request for a reference about a customer, but its envelope is of greater interest. What do you observe?" I took the thing between thumb and forefinger. The paper was cheap, the sort used for circulars. There was a faint, sweet odor, a smear of some light grit along the lower edge, and a thumb mark in a pale, chalky dust. "The scent is lavender," I ventured. "The grit, sand? The thumb mark may be flour." "Very good indeed," said Holmes with a gleam of approval. "Lavender water is the poor man's luxury, but this is not the London variety. It is the provincial distillation, less oil, a cruder note. The grit is not river sand. It is road dust with a trace of iron, which tells me the street upon which the writer walked is frequented by farriers or wheelwrights. The chalk upon the thumb, flour as you remark, added to the hour at which the pillar box was cleared suggests a baker. Hence, a provincial baker from a small town with a wheelwright, say Romford or Mitcham, has dealt with this tradesman and seeks a reference against an untrustworthy customer. The letter is timed to catch a train that arrives at Liverpool Street before 8, which confirms a not too distant origin. You astound me, I confessed. He smiled and laid the letter aside. It is an error to starve the little grey cells. They thrive upon such trifles. Now to our vicar. There is much here that is theatrical, and I distrust theatricals when they are thrust upon me uninvited. Let us be off. We were soon seated in a second-class compartment, the lamps trembling faintly above our heads and the countryside unwinding in damp ribbons beyond the blurred glass. Holmes had sunk into one of his singular fits of abstraction. His face, with its strong, clean lines and hawk-like nose, might have been carved from ivory were it not for the occasional flicker of his long fingers upon his knee. I knew better than to press him with questions in these moods. Presently he stirred, took from his pocket the Reverend's card, and balanced it upon his forefinger. "Watson," said he, "let us arrange the simple facts, that we may see where the complicated ones must lie. A man, Mr. Nathaniel Arkwright, dies of apoplexy and is buried. 2 nights later, the sexton hears a rhythmic sound, described as a beating heart. The soil shows slight disturbance. A single withered rose stands upright where none had been. What do you make of it?" "The noise may have some natural origin," I said slowly, "and the rest a trick. Or the trick lies in the noise and the disturbance is genuine. But whose trick, and to what end?" "Just so. When a phenomenon impresses itself upon a community, there are 2 crops that ripen at once, fear and opportunity. Ask yourself, who profits by fear? Who profits by opportunity?" "The nephew," I said, recalling the name. "Leonard Arkwright. If there is money to be had by discrediting the burial or hastening some legal action, though I confess I do not see how." "Confess nothing yet," Holmes replied with a tolerant gesture. "We do not know the terms of the elder Arkwright's will, nor whether its conditions are fixed upon any date or event. Yet nephews are traditional recipients of ill will and good legacies. Then there is the sexton, Caleb Barnes, 40 years a servant of the parish. Longevity argues reliability, but it may also provide the cloak for a long habit of petty graft. A graveyard is a place where the scruples of the living are pliable. You suspect the sexton? I suspect everyone until the facts compel me to relax my grip, said he. Let us add to our little cast the local surgeon, Dr. Phelps, who pronounced apoplexy. We shall accept his diagnosis, but we shall not forget that apoplexy is a comfortable verdict, too comfortable at times. Lastly, our vicar, who is clearly conscientious and yet curiously quick to entreat outside help. What? Because he fears scandal? Or because his conscience will not permit him to sanction some act others propose? I looked out upon the smudged fields and saw in fancy a glistening churchyard with leaning stones and drooping yew, the wet earth breathing out its chill. Holmes, I said, you speak of theatricals. The upright rose, it is a gesture, a sign. Precisely. The hand that pushes a rose into new-turned soil wishes to be seen, or at least to be guessed at. It is the sort of touch that appeals to rustic imaginations. It whispers, he that was buried sends this token. Such whispers, my dear fellow, can be encouraged by certain minds for very practical ends. And the sound, the thudding? Holmes shrugged. There are natural agencies, roots under stress, water trapped in a coffin vault, the oscillation of an iron rail. There are also human agencies, a concealed mechanism, a buried tube, a man with a stick. Until we have stood upon the spot, I shall not degrade my mind with too many hypotheses. He touched my sleeve with the point of his finger. Observe the gentleman who has just come aboard. The train had paused at a small junction, and a tall, spare man in a black coat had entered our compartment, doffing his hat with a polite murmur before seating himself opposite. He was about 35, with a narrow head, clean-shaven cheeks, and a pallor that hinted at a sedentary life. He carried a leather portfolio and wore gloves despite the relative mildness of the carriage. Legal, Holmes breathed so low that I barely heard it. Ink stain along the middle finger of the right hand, recent. Cuff smooth where it rubs the desk. Collar frayed at the inner edge, a sign of long hours. Boots carefully polished but scarred above the instep by a fallen portfolio clasp, and a faint odor of sealing wax. County solicitor, Chislehurst or its neighbor. If our new companion had been privy to Holmes's summing up, he gave no sign. He sat in composed silence, his eyes moving over his papers, until we drew near a station whose signboard, looming through the rain, bore the name of our destination. As we gathered our things, the gentleman rose likewise and in doing so, allowed the corner of a document to protrude. I could not help but note the heading, The Estate of Nathaniel Arkwright, deceased. Holmes's eyes quickened. He offered the man a slight bow. You go down to Chislehurst, sir? I do, the other replied with a cautious glance. Montague Bligh of Bligh and Harcourt. You have the advantage of me. Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We have been invited to look into a small parish difficulty. Bligh's expression altered almost imperceptibly. He hesitated, then said, I should be glad of any light you can throw upon it, Mr. Holmes. My firm has acted in Mr. Arkwright's affairs for many years. Then you will know whether fear or opportunity is the more plentiful commodity at present, Holmes returned, with one of his sudden dry smiles. Bligh allowed himself a thin smile in answer. I should say both are abundant, sir. The villagers fear scandal. Certain parties may discover opportunities in confusion. But I should not speak further upon the platform. We descended together. The rain had abated to a fine mist that clung to one's face like breath. A trap awaited the solicitor. He touched his hat and was driven off. Holmes stood for a moment upon the wet stones, his nostrils dilated, as if scenting the air of a battlefield. Come, Watson, he said briskly. We shall call first upon the churchyard, and after that upon the dead man's house. If we are fortunate, we shall hear no heartbeat at all. The village lay muted under the damp. The hedges dripped, and the November leaves, trodden into a brown paste, gave forth that clean, earthy odor peculiar to English lanes after rain. As we turned the corner by a flint wall over which the yew spires rose, the bell of St. Stephen's tolled a single note that hung in the mist. I thought of the vicar's wan, anxious face and of the sexton's cottage overlooking the graves. Holmes touched my arm once more and I perceived, half hidden by the lich gate, a man with a stoop and a shawl tied close about his throat, peering out as though from a burrow. Caleb Barnes, said Holmes softly. And there, advancing with the stiff dignity of a man accustomed to authority, comes Reverend Fortescue himself. Excellent. Let us listen to them before they listen to us. As we passed beneath the ancient timber of the gate, Holmes cast a swift glance at the path. His gaze lingered where the gravel met the grass, where thin, pale scratches traced a wavering line towards the stones. He said nothing, but I saw, by the sudden narrowing of his eyes, that in that delicate disturbance, so slight that another might have missed it altogether, he had already heard the first faint echo of an explanation. We stepped into the churchyard and the damp air received us. Somewhere beyond the rows of tilting stones, a rook gave a rusty croak and rose, black against the low sky. The grave with the withered rose awaited us, and with it the first true test of the vicar's tale. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. The churchyard of St. Stephen's was a place of damp silence, the air heavy with that mingled scent of moss, turned soil, and ancient stone that clings to such grounds. The yews hunched like dark sentinels, their branches shedding a fine mist upon the graves below. Reverend Fortescue advanced toward us along the gravel path, his long coat trailing at his heels, while the stooped figure of Caleb Barnes shuffled in his wake. Holmes greeted them with a slight inclination of the head, his eyes roving, not at the men but at the earth, the stones, the wrought iron railings, and the little details that seemed to catch his attention in passing. "You have come early, Mr. Holmes," the vicar remarked, his voice pitched low as though unwilling to disturb the quiet dead. "The morning is the proper time to greet the truth, Reverend," Holmes replied. "It is then most alert, before the affairs of the day have dulled its senses." We followed Fortescue along a side path, the gravel crunching underfoot. Caleb Barnes trailed behind, glancing now and then over his shoulder toward the lich gate, as though he expected someone, or something, to be following us. His gnarled hands clutched his shawl, and the deep creases in his weather-worn face spoke of more than simple age. They spoke of a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel, and to fearing what might happen if he broke it. The Arkwright grave lay in the far corner, where the churchyard wall curved away and met a line of hedgerow. The plot was modest. A new headstone of polished granite stood at its head, the inscription still sharp and clean. Below, the earth had been neatly turfed, save for a single patch where the grass was not yet settled, and where a faint darkening marked the soil as recently disturbed. It was there that the withered rose stood upright, its head drooping as though under some invisible weight. Holmes paused several feet away, scanning the surroundings with that peculiar darting gaze which seemed to absorb everything at once. He crouched suddenly, his long fingers brushing the gravel path. When he rose, there was the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes, though he said nothing. "This is where I heard it, sir," Barnes muttered, his voice a husky whisper. "Night before last. Sounded like it were deep down, muffled like, but steady. Thump, thump, as if it had a mind to keep time with my own heart. I've been sexton here near on 40 years, and never heard the like before." Holmes fixed him with a sudden, penetrating glance. "Describe precisely what you were doing when you heard it." "I was at my window, sir. Can see the graves plain from there if the moon's out. It was just after midnight, quiet as the grave, begging your pardon, and I hears it. Went out to look, but there were not moving. Just that sound, steady-like, coming from the earth itself." "And you told no one until morning?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "Went straight to the Reverend here, sir. Didn't want folks to start in with their tales, you understand." Holmes stepped closer to the grave, his gaze taking in the upright rose. Without touching it, he bent low, his profile cutting a sharp line against the pale stone. "This was not here when the grave was filled?" "No, sir," Barnes replied. "That there was laid with the rest of the flowers on the coffin. Can't say as how it got to stand up like that." Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the line of the churchyard wall, then the hedgerow beyond. He walked a slow circuit around the grave, the wet grass muffling his steps. Twice he stopped to peer at the ground where the turf met the soil, and once to examine the base of the headstone itself. His cane, a plain, dark stick he carried more as a tool than an ornament, prodded lightly at the earth in several places. "Watson," he said, beckoning me over, "observe the texture of the soil here and then here." I bent down as he indicated two spots, one directly before the headstone, the other at the rear of the grave. The soil in front was loose, the particles dark with moisture, while at the back it seemed more compact, with a slightly different color, almost reddish in hue. "You see the difference?" Holmes asked. He admitted. "But I cannot guess the cause." "Then keep it in mind," he said simply, moving away. The vicar watched him with an air of restrained curiosity. "Mr. Holmes, do you find this grave altered?" "I find it curious," Holmes replied, his tone deliberately neutral. "Tell me, Reverend, was the funeral well attended?" "A fair number, Fortescue said. Mr. Arkwright was a man of means if not of many close friends. Some villagers came out of respect, others for form's sake. The nephew, Leonard Arkwright, stood chief mourner. Holmes nodded absently. And since the burial, has anyone had cause to visit the grave? Any widows of the parish laying flowers? Any children at play? None that I know of, Fortescue said. We keep the gates locked after dusk. Holmes's eyes slid briefly toward the sexton. And yet, he murmured, the locked gate is an excellent assurance to the honest man, but a trivial obstacle to one who has no intention of being honest. Without further word, he strode toward the hedgerow. I followed, noting how the damp earth grew softer there. Holmes paused and bent low, parting the leaves with his stick. The hedge concealed a narrow gap in the churchyard wall, no more than 18 inches wide, where the mortar had crumbled away. On the far side lay a rutted track leading toward a stand of trees. A convenient entrance, Holmes remarked. Not for the casual stroller, but for one who knows it is here, very convenient indeed. The vicar frowned. I had no idea. No doubt, Holmes said lightly. Such defects rarely announce themselves to the casual eye. He returned to the grave and stood there for some moments, his hands clasped behind him, the rain beginning to beat upon the brim of his hat. We must also consider, he said at last, that what is heard is not always what is. Mr. Barnes, this thudding, did it cease suddenly or fade away? It stopped all at once, sir. Dead still after that. Holmes's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. An interesting choice of phrase. He took a final look around, then turned to the vicar. Reverend Fortescue, I should like to see Hawthorne Lodge as soon as convenient. But before that there is one matter to settle. Tonight we shall watch the grave. The vicar's eyes widened slightly. You mean to be here at midnight? Precisely. If there is a hand behind this, it is a hand that will strike again so long as it believes itself unseen. We must provide the illusion of neglect by day, and our presence by night. Barnes crossed himself, muttering something about disturbing the rest of the dead. Holmes merely smiled faintly and began walking back toward the lich gate. As we left the grave behind, I could not help glancing back at that solitary rose, standing stiffly from the damp earth. In the pale light it seemed almost to lean toward us as though listening. A faint shiver traced my spine. Holmes, catching my glance, said nothing, but I noticed his eyes were alight with that peculiar gleam which meant the chase had truly begun. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. From the churchyard we walked up the gentle incline toward Hawthorne Lodge, the late Mr. Arkwright's residence. The lane was narrow and hemmed by tall hedges that dripped with the morning's mist. Here and there, a few villagers passed, tipping their hats or casting furtive glances at us, as though our presence were already a matter of discussion. I could sense in their subdued movements that curious mixture of respect and superstition which the English countryside so often harbors when death and whispers of the unnatural coincide. Hawthorne Lodge appeared at last between two weathered stone pillars topped with mossy urns. The house was of moderate size, built in the Georgian style, its symmetry slightly marred by ivy that clung to one side and had nearly swallowed an upper window. A gravel drive led to the front door, where we were met by a man in a dark suit whose impassive face suggested long service. This is Chalmers, the butler, Reverend Fortescue explained. He has served the Arkwright family for many years. Holmes's gaze lingered upon the man's hands, which were neatly gloved despite the mildness of the morning. We should like to speak with Mr. Leonard Arkwright, Holmes said. Chalmers inclined his head. Mr. Arkwright is in the study. If you will follow me. The study was a high-ceilinged room at the back of the house, its shelves lined with volumes of travel, colonial reports, and the occasional well-thumbed novel. Behind a large desk sat a young man of perhaps 28, clean-shaven, with carefully brushed hair and a suit that owed more to the London tailor than the country outfitter. He rose as we entered, his expression guarded but polite. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said. Reverend Fortescue has spoken of your visit. I gather this concerns the, unpleasant rumors in the village? Holmes accepted the offered chair, his keen eyes fixed upon the younger man's face. It concerns, Mr. Arkwright, the integrity of your uncle's grave, and perhaps more besides. I should like to know who was present at the funeral, aside from yourself. Leonard hesitated. A few local acquaintances, some of the servants, and Mr. Bligh, my uncle's solicitor. The rest were villagers who attended out of courtesy. And in the days before your uncle's death? Holmes asked. There were no visitors of note. My uncle lived quietly. He had spent much of his life abroad, as you may know, and seemed to prefer his own company. I came down from London when I received the telegram that he had taken ill, but by the time I arrived he was gone. Holmes tapped a long finger against the arm of his chair. Dr. Phelps pronounced death by apoplexy. Was there any dispute over that? None, Leonard replied quickly. My uncle had suffered from dizziness and weakness in the weeks before. Dr. Phelps assured me it was not unexpected. Holmes inclined his head, but his eyes did not soften. And the servants? Are they all still in the house? Most. Chalmers, of course, and Mrs. Doran, the housekeeper. There is also Henry, the gardener, and a maid named Alice. Leonard's tone sharpened slightly. I hope you are not suggesting. I suggest nothing, Holmes interrupted smoothly. But in cases where strange disturbances follow a burial, one must consider who might gain by provoking fear, or by distracting attention. Leonard's gaze flickered toward the window. The will has not yet been read. If you mean to imply. I imply only that the reading of wills often casts a fresh light upon motives, Holmes said, rising. Perhaps we might meet the staff. Reluctantly, Leonard summoned them. Mrs. Doran, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with a florid complexion and eyes that seemed to avoid Holmes's. She spoke of the late Mr. Arkwright with proper respect, though I detected no warmth in her reminiscences. Henry, the gardener, was a lean man with rough hands and a suspicious air. He claimed to have been in the potting shed on the nights in question, though Holmes's gentle probing revealed that no one could verify his whereabouts after sunset. Alice, the young maid, appeared timid and pale, twisting her apron as she answered Holmes's quiet questions. Did you see anyone near the churchyard after dark? Holmes asked her. No, sir, she said. But, well, I did hear something once. Night before last, just after I'd gone to bed. A sound like wheels on the gravel outside. When I looked out, I thought I saw a lantern moving away down the lane. I told Mrs. Doran, but she said it must have been the vicar. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me before nodding gravely. You did well to remember it. When the staff had gone, Holmes lingered a moment by the desk, running his fingers lightly along its surface. His eyes rested upon a blotter, beneath which a corner of a folded paper protruded. He did not touch it, but his gaze sharpened. Then, without explanation, he turned to Leonard. One more question. Have you noticed anything missing from your uncle's effects? Leonard shook his head. No. Why? Holmes gave a thin smile. Merely curiosity. Thank you for your time, Mr. Arkwright. We shall be in the village until this matter is resolved. In the meantime, I should be grateful if you would refrain from discussing our visit. As we left the lodge, the air seemed cooler, though the mist had begun to lift. Holmes walked in silence until we reached the lane, where he paused and glanced back at the ivy-clad house. Well, Watson? He asked. They all seemed uneasy, I said. But if you ask me, the maid's story of the lantern is the most suggestive. Someone could have slipped into the churchyard by that gap in the wall. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Just so. And note how her account was dismissed by Mrs. Doran. That is not always the reaction of innocence. But we must not judge yet. There is another party to consider, Dr. Phelps. I should like to know how apoplexy came to be the final word in this affair. We turned back toward the heart of the village, where the neat cottages huddled around the green. From the corner of my eye I caught sight of a figure watching us from an upstairs window, a pale oval of a face quickly withdrawn. Whether it belonged to friend, foe, or fearful onlooker I could not say. Holmes quickened his pace. Come, Watson. We have met the family and the household. Now we must meet the man who certified the death. If there is a deception here, its roots may go deeper than the grave itself. Chapter 5. First Suspects, the Red Herring. Dr. Lionel Phelps kept his surgery in a neat, red-brick building on the road between the village green and the railway station. Its windows, polished to a near-military gleam, looked out over a clipped lawn and a single sycamore whose leaves rattled faintly in the soft breeze. We found the door ajar, and at Holmes's knock a brisk voice bade us enter. The man who rose from behind the writing table was of middle years, his dark hair streaked liberally with gray, and his frame tall but beginning to stoop. He had a professional air of briskness that seemed designed to put a patient at ease, though in Holmes's presence it acquired a faint stiffness. Mr. Holmes, he said, extending a hand, and Dr. Watson, I presume. The Reverend Fortescue sent word you might be calling. Please sit. Holmes declined the chair, remaining standing with that faint air of polite dominance he reserved for interviews in which he intended to steer the conversation. You attended Mr. Nathaniel Arkwright in his last illness, I believe, Dr. Phelps? I did, though to call it an illness would be a kindness. The poor gentleman died suddenly. He had a seizure, apoplexy beyond question. I was summoned by a servant, but by the time I arrived, life was extinct. Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. You were certain of the diagnosis? Quite. Mr. Arkwright had been troubled with giddiness and a weak pulse for weeks. His arteries were in a deplorable state, degeneration very advanced. There was nothing suspicious in his passing. Holmes's gaze drifted over the surgery, its orderly rows of bottles, the framed diplomas, the faint odor of disinfectant. No injuries? No signs of violence. Phelps's brows drew together. None whatever. Yet I understand that since the burial, disturbances have occurred at his grave. A fleeting shadow crossed the doctor's face. Yes, though I attach no credence to them. Barnes, the sexton, is a steady enough fellow, but imagination can play strange tricks at night, especially in a place like that. As for the soil being disturbed, well, ground settles, particularly after heavy rain. Holmes smiled faintly. A very reasonable explanation, and one which Scotland Yard will doubtless adopt when they arrive. Scotland Yard. Yes. Inspector Lestrade has been in the district since yesterday, on an unrelated matter. It is certain that word will reach him. And when it does, he will be eager to resolve it quickly. The simplest solution, the sexton perhaps, will tempt him greatly. Dr. Phelps gave a dry laugh. If the Yard wishes to blame Barnes, they'll find no objection from me. It will put an end to the gossip. Holmes's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. And yet, Barnes gains nothing by such a deception, unless, of course, there is some animosity between him and the Arkwright family? The doctor hesitated. Barnes and the late Mr. Arkwright were not friendly. There had been words over a boundary wall some years ago. But I doubt the man would resort to childish tricks. When we left the surgery, Holmes was silent until we had turned into a quieter lane. There you have it, Watson. Lestrade will have his ready-made suspect before the day is out. An elderly sexton with a grievance, an opportunity to slip into the churchyard at night, and a taste for rustic mischief. The motive will be called spite. It is all so conveniently untidy that it invites acceptance. And you do not accept it? I asked. Holmes gave a short laugh. My dear fellow, if Barnes had wished to vex the Arkwright name, there are simpler means than inventing a heartbeat beneath the soil. This is theatre, Watson, performed for an audience. The question is, who is in the stalls? We dined that evening at the small inn on the green, where Lestrade himself appeared just as we were finishing. His compact frame and sharp features were unchanged since last we met, though his tweed suit bore the creases of recent travel. Holmes, he exclaimed, pulling up a chair uninvited. I hear you're sniffing about that grave business. I could have told you at once. It's the sexton. Man's half mad with old grudges and too much whiskey. I'll have it signed and sealed before tomorrow. Holmes's expression was one of mild amusement. And what is your evidence, Lestrade? Evidence? Well, he admits to being on the spot both nights, doesn't he? Heard the noise himself, claims to have seen the soil disturbed. And who else had the run of the place after dark? There's your man. Very neat, Holmes said. Too neat, perhaps. Lestrade grinned. You're welcome to your theories, Holmes, but I'll wager you a sovereign Barnes will confess before week's end. Holmes spread his hands in mock surrender. I never wager on a certainty, Lestrade. Pray pursue your line, it will keep the culprit's attention fixed in one direction while I look in another. After Lestrade had departed to make a few inquiries, Holmes leaned toward me across the table. There, Watson, is our red herring delivered in person by Scotland Yard. While Lestrade chases Barnes, we shall watch the grave tonight as planned. If the play is to be staged again, we shall be in the best seats. By 11 that night we were in the churchyard, concealed behind a row of leaning stones that commanded a clear view of the Arkwright grave. The moon rode high between drifting clouds, lending the hues of blacker shadow. Barnes had been persuaded to remain in his cottage, though I thought I glimpsed his curtain twitch once or twice. Holmes crouched beside me, motionless save for the slow movement of his eyes. Midnight came and went. The air was still save for the occasional rustle of a leaf or the faint creak of the church's weathercock. I had begun to think the night would pass without event when Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. From the direction of the hedgerow came the faintest glimmer, a small swinging light low to the ground. It moved toward the gap in the wall, then paused. A shadow slipped through and crossed the grass with surprising swiftness. The lantern's glow touched the edge of the grave, then winked out. We waited, breath held. The figure crouched, and in the silence there came a sound, a dull rhythmic thudding, exactly as the vicar had described. Holmes's eyes shone in the moonlight. You see, Watson, our play is indeed in performance. He did not move to intercept, but watched with the intentness of a man memorizing every gesture. At last the sound ceased, the figure straightened, replaced the lantern's shade and melted back toward the hedgerow. When all was still again, Holmes rose. "We know now, Watson, that the ghost in the grave has flesh and blood. The question is, whose?" Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. We waited until the soft crunch of retreating footsteps had faded entirely and the hedgerow lay still in the moonlight. Only then did Holmes move, slipping from our cover with the noiseless tread of a cat. I followed, my eyes scanning the silvered grass for any sign of movement, though the churchyard was deserted. The grave lay as we had seen it earlier that day, save for one thing. The withered rose was gone. Holmes knelt at the head of the plot, his dark silhouette bent against the granite headstone. "Lantern off, Watson," he murmured. "We must rely on the moonlight for now." I obeyed, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw his hands move over the turf with deliberate care, his long fingers feeling for something beneath the grass. At last he produced a small, flat object, no larger than a half-crown, which glinted faintly in the light. "What is it?" I whispered. "A button," Holmes replied softly. "From a coat of good cloth with a fragment of dark thread still attached. Look at the edge, scraped as though dragged against stone." He slipped it into his pocket, then examined the soil where the rose had stood. "Notice, Watson, the depression here is deeper than this morning. And, observe this." He indicated a faint groove leading from the grave toward the path, scarcely visible unless the light struck it at the right angle. Something was drawn along the ground, something narrow and of some weight. "A tool?" I suggested. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Or a length of thin tubing." The thudding we heard could be transmitted from a distance if such a device were employed. Imagine a rod or tube reaching into the coffin space, struck at the other end to create that muffled resonance. The notion sent an involuntary shiver along my spine. But to what end? To suggest that Mr. Arkwright still lives. Precisely. And to what purpose is such an illusion put, Watson? Fear in the hearts of those who might have an interest in the grave remaining closed. We must ask ourselves who such a person might be. He rose, brushing his hands against his coat. Let us also note the absence of the rose. It was not simply knocked over in the disturbance, it was taken. What? A token? Or because it bore some trace, perhaps soil or fiber, that the culprit did not wish to leave behind. We circled the grave slowly, Holmes pausing at the foot where the grass met the wall's shadow. "Here," he said, crouching again. "A partial footprint, heel only. The rest lost in the slope. Narrow-soled, with a distinct notch at the outer edge. Not the boot of a laborer." The clouds thinned overhead, bathing the scene in pale clarity. Holmes straightened, his eyes scanning the hedgerow. The figure moved with confidence. No hesitation at the gap in the wall, no fumbling with the lantern. This is not the act of a frightened rustic. It is someone who knows the ground intimately. "Barnes?" I ventured, though even as I spoke I recalled Holmes's earlier dismissal of the sexton as too obvious a culprit. He shook his head. "Barnes moves more slowly, his gait is heavy." This was a lighter step. And we must remember the maid's account of a lantern leaving the lodge. A possibility presents itself, Watson, but we require more than possibility to proceed. We withdrew by the same route, slipping through the lich gate into the deserted lane. The village slept under its canopy of mist, the windows dark, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Holmes walked in silence until we reached the small parlor at the inn that served as our sitting room. Once inside, he lit the lamp, drew the curtains and placed the recovered button upon the table. "Watson, you will observe the maker's mark, Thacker and Sons, Jermyn Street. A West End tailor catering to a clientele more likely found in club armchairs than in a churchyard at midnight." "Leonard Arkwright?" I asked. Holmes's smile was faint but approving. Our young heir does favor a certain elegance in his attire. However, let us not leap to the gallows before the rope is tied. This could belong to another entirely, Mr. Bligh for example. His portfolio and papers suggest late hours, and a solicitor might have his own reasons for nocturnal excursions. I leaned back, considering. And the tubing, if such was used, would require preparation. It could not be improvised on the spot. Indeed. Which means it may yet be hidden nearby. A search in daylight may reveal more than our eyes can manage now. He extinguished the lamp, leaving us in near darkness, and added quietly, "There is an inconsistency here, Watson, that troubles me. The man at the grave performed his pantomime without audience, save ourselves. If the purpose was to frighten, Why choose a night when no one was likely to witness it? To keep the illusion alive? Perhaps. Or to maintain the condition of the grave for some other purpose entirely. We may yet find that the beating heart is not the central mystery, but only the lure to draw attention, or misdirect it. Morning found Holmes already abroad, returning with a spray of damp leaves clinging to his coat. He spread a sheet of paper on the table, upon which lay 3 items: the button from the night before, a scrap of coarse string, and a narrow metal coupling such as might be used to join 2 hollow rods. Recovered near the wall, he explained. Our phantom's equipment is incomplete. The rest, I suspect, is hidden where only one with the key may retrieve it. And you know where that is? I have a strong suspicion, Holmes said, with that glint in his eye that I had come to recognize as the herald of decisive action. But before I act, I wish to hear more from a certain timid maid. People often remember details they did not at first deem important. This morning's conversation may tell us if the lantern she saw belongs to the lodge, or to someone who visited it. He took up his hat. Watson, we are now beyond mere ghostly fancies. The question is no longer who disturbed the grave, but what they sought beneath it, or feared others would find there. As we stepped out into the brisk air, I could not help but feel that the first solid strand of the puzzle had been drawn taut. Somewhere in the tangle of ivy, lantern light, and midnight thudding lay the truth, and Holmes had begun to tug at it with that quiet certainty that always meant the game was turning in his favor. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. We found Alice in the scullery at Hawthorne Lodge, polishing a row of copper pans until they reflected the pale light of the overcast morning. She startled when we entered, her hands faltering on the cloth. Holmes, with his usual talent for disarming the wary, offered her a cordial greeting and a question about the weather, as though our visit had no particular purpose. You mentioned last time, Miss Alice, he said gently, that you saw a lantern leaving the lodge on the night before last. I've been thinking about that. Can you tell me more? Her eyes flicked toward the doorway, but there was no sound from the hall. It was late, sir, nearly midnight, I think. I had been to fetch some water and happened to look out of my window. There's a bit of a view down the drive from there. I saw a small light, bobbing as if someone was carrying it. It went toward the gates, then turned right down the lane. Holmes leaned lightly on the edge of the table. And you could not see who carried it? No, sir. Too dark and the light was shaded. But, she hesitated. It seemed a man, taller than me anyway and walking quick. From which part of the house did the light first appear? Alice frowned in concentration. From the side entrance, the one by the garden. Not from the front door. Holmes gave a small nod, as though this confirmed something he already suspected. And did you mention this to anyone other than Mrs. Doran? No, sir. She told me it was nothing, said the vicar might have come by to see Mr. Leonard. Interesting, Holmes murmured. Thank you, Miss Alice. You have been most helpful. One more thing, have you noticed anything missing from the lodge recently? Alice's brow furrowed. Well, the gardener's shed was open yesterday morning. Henry said he must have left it that way, but he's not one to forget. Holmes's eyes lit briefly. Ah. And what does the shed contain? Tools, sir, and lengths of piping for the watering pump. Holmes offered her a brief smile and we took our leave. Once we were in the lane again, I could not help asking, you think the piping could be part of your tube theory? An excellent possibility, he replied. The coupling I found would fit such piping exactly. And the garden shed, conveniently at the rear of the property, offers a discreet point of access for anyone wishing to collect or return it unseen. We had not gone more than 20 yards before a figure appeared at the bend in the lane, striding toward us with purpose. It was Montague Bligh, the solicitor, his portfolio under one arm. His normally composed expression was strained. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he called. You may wish to hear this at once. The lodge has been entered. We quickened our pace. When? Holmes asked. Sometime last night, Bligh said. Mr. Leonard called me not an hour ago. His uncle's study, where the personal papers were kept, was found in disorder this morning. A drawer broken and certain documents missing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And what documents were those? Letters from Mr. Arkwright's years abroad, chiefly. But there was also a small tin box. I never knew its contents, it was kept locked, but Mr. Arkwright valued it highly. Leonard says it is gone. By the time we reached the lodge, Leonard was pacing the study floor, his face pale and his manner agitated. I locked the room myself yesterday, he declared. Only Chalmers and I have keys. Yet this morning I found the lock forced and the desk rifled. Whoever it was took only that box and the packet of letters. Nothing else was touched. Holmes examined the lock, then the window. The entry was here, he said, pointing to faint tool marks on the sill. From the garden side. The intruder knew exactly what he wanted, and where it was kept. There is no sign of hasty rummaging. Leonard glanced at Bly. Surely the sexton couldn't be behind this? Holmes ignored the question. He had moved to the fireplace, where his eyes fixed on a small scattering of reddish grains upon the hearth. Watson, he said, what does this look like to you? I bent to examine it. Brick dust. Precisely. And note the smell, faint but metallic. Iron in the mortar. This residue matches the composition of the churchyard wall where the gap lies. Our nocturnal visitor passed that way before entering here. Leonard's voice sharpened. Then you think the same man who staged the grave disturbance came here? I think it very likely, Holmes replied. The theft and the charade in the churchyard are linked, though I cannot yet say whether one was meant to conceal the other or to enhance it. But the sequence is suggestive. First, a supposed heartbeat in the grave to draw attention. Then, while eyes are fixed there, a quiet entry into the lodge to remove certain property. Bly cleared his throat. Might the box and letters be of financial value? Holmes's gaze lingered on him for a moment. Value is not always measured in coin, Mr. Bly. A secret, once in the wrong hands, can be worth more than gold, or cost more than life. Holmes turned to Leonard. You must take certain precautions. Double-lock this room and keep the key on your person. And I strongly advise you to make a careful list of anything else you cannot immediately account for. Leonard looked both bewildered and unsettled, but promised compliance. When we were again in the lane, I said, this complicates matters. Now we have a graveyard intruder and a housebreaker, perhaps one and the same. But why take old letters in a locked tin box? Holmes smiled faintly. Because, my dear Watson, those letters may hold something far more dangerous than sentiment, and the box, perhaps, the proof of it. We are not merely chasing a ghost in a churchyard now, we are treading on the edge of a history someone would rather bury deeper than any coffin. He quickened his pace toward the inn. Tonight we shall repeat our watch at the grave. And this time, Watson, I do not think we will be the only hunters abroad. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Holmes spent the afternoon in a state of restless, contained energy, moving between our small and sitting room and the street outside, vanishing for intervals only to return with some seemingly insignificant object or scrap of news. I knew better than to demand explanations prematurely. In such moods, he preferred to let his work ripen unseen until it was ready to be revealed. It was close to dusk when he finally spoke at length. Watson, I am now certain that last night's performance in the churchyard was never intended for the sexton's ears at all. It was meant to be overheard by someone specific. But the choice of hour, and the absence of any overt display toward the village, tell me that our culprit is playing to a very narrow audience. An audience of one? I suggested. Perhaps two, he said. It is possible we have both a perpetrator and an accomplice within the same circle. And now, he glanced at the mantel clock, we shall see whether they can be provoked into betraying themselves. He rummaged in his valise and drew out a small length of thin metal tubing, no more than 2 feet long, capped at one end with a freshly cut cork. Our own stage prop, he said, holding it up. I found it this morning in the hedgerow, half buried in leaves, discarded carelessly but telling in its construction. The joinery matches the coupling we discovered earlier, suggesting a longer apparatus in sections. Tonight we return it to the grave, under slightly altered conditions. We set out after dark, the moon's pale arc veiled by a slow-moving haze. The village was quiet, even the public house on the green gave off only a muffled hum of voices. Holmes moved swiftly along the lane, his gaze darting toward the hedgerow gap as we passed. In the churchyard, we kept to the shadows until we reached the Arkwright grave. Holmes knelt at the head, examining the turf with his lens. Still compact from yesterday, he murmured. Our visitor has not returned since the theft at the lodge. That means one of two things: the charade has served its purpose, or they are cautious after their success. From his pocket, he produced the recovered section of tubing and pressed it carefully into the soil where the rose had stood. Then, withdrawing a coil of fine thread from his coat, he attached one end to the corked opening and let the other trail toward our hiding place behind a pair of leaning stones. I shall give it a single measured tap every few minutes, he explained. If the sound draws our quarry, they will come to investigate, and in so doing, will reveal both their route and their degree of boldness. We crouched in silence, the minutes dragging. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked and the echo came thin through the mist. At intervals, Holmes leaned forward and gave the thread a subtle tug. The earth seemed to answer with a dull, buried thump. It was after the fourth such signal that we heard it, a faint scuff of shoe on gravel, followed by the whisper of something brushing against leaves. The sound came not from the hedgerow gap, but from the opposite side of the yard, where a narrow path skirted the church itself. Holmes's eyes met mine in the gloom, and he inclined his head slightly as if to say, "Note that." The steps halted. A figure detached itself from the darkness near the porch, a man judging by his height and gait, dressed in dark clothes and carrying no light. He moved with deliberate care toward the grave, pausing every few paces to listen. We waited another quarter of an hour, but no further movement came. Holmes retrieved the tubing, brushing the damp soil from his gloves. "Enough for tonight. Tomorrow we map every entrance to this churchyard, including those known only to certain privileged keys." As we returned to the inn, Holmes was unusually reflective. "You saw how he lingered after examining the tube? That was not merely curiosity, it was calculation. He will act soon, Watson, and when he does, we must be ready to close the net." The next morning, true to his word, Holmes led me on a systematic survey of the churchyard boundaries. At the far end, behind a line of weathered tombs, we found a small wooden gate, its planks warped with age and half hidden by ivy. The lock was rusted, but the bolt moved freely, oiled recently. Holmes knelt, running his fingers over the soil. Fresh impressions, narrow soles as before. "Our night visitor favors this route." He straightened, brushing the ivy aside to reveal a narrow alley between the church wall and the rear gardens of several cottages. A discreet path indeed, and one that ends at the back door of the vicarage. "You suspect Reverend Fortescue?" I asked, startled. "I suspect nothing without proof," Holmes replied. "But the vicarage offers privacy and a legitimate reason to be abroad near the church at night. If the Reverend is innocent, someone else is making use of his proximity." Before I could reply, a shadow fell across the gate. We turned to find Inspector Lestrade, his expression one of self-satisfaction. "I thought I might find you here, Holmes." "Good news," the sexton's agreed to make a statement. "Says he saw a man leaving the yard the other night." "Indeed?" Holmes said mildly. "And who does he name?" Lestrade smiled thinly. "Leonard Arkwright. Says he recognized the figure by his build and walk. I'll have him brought in before supper." Holmes's gaze was unreadable. "Do as you must, Lestrade. But remember, appearances like graves can be deceptive." We watched him stride away and I could feel the net tightening, not necessarily around the right man. Holmes, however, seemed almost pleased. "A premature arrest, Watson, will flush our real quarry into the open. The question is whether we can be there when it happens." Chapter 9. A second attempt, the culprit strikes again. Lestrade's determination to arrest Leonard Arkwright cast a palpable tension over the village that day. Word spread with the speed peculiar to small communities, whispered from the drapers to the post office, carried on the breath of those who took care to say nothing aloud when we passed, but whose eyes spoke volumes. Holmes, however, appeared serenely unmoved by the gossip. Indeed, there was almost a trace of anticipation in his manner, as though he were waiting for a clock to strike a predetermined hour. By mid-afternoon, we learned that Leonard had been taken to the small constable's office in the next village for questioning. Lestrade's satisfaction was complete. "I'll have him remanded by morning," he declared when we crossed paths outside the inn. "Once he's cooling his heels in a cell, this whole graveyard business will stop dead in its tracks." Holmes merely smiled faintly. "Perhaps it will, Lestrade. Or perhaps you will find that such disturbances are not so easily laid to rest." That evening, Holmes insisted we return to the churchyard. "Our friend will move tonight," he told me as we left the inn after dusk. "The arrest has removed the most obvious suspect, which means the true culprit will feel safer. But in truth, the danger for them is greater than ever, if they must act to secure what remains unfinished." The air was sharper than on previous nights, and a thin mist curled between the stones. We took up our position near the hedgerow gap, concealed behind a broad-shouldered monument whose inscription had long since faded to illegibility. The moon was obscured, leaving the scene in a half-light broken only by the dim gleam from the Lichgate lamp. For an hour nothing stirred. My mind began to wander to the warmth of the inn when Holmes's hand shot out, gripping my sleeve. From the far side of the yard, the church wall side, came the unmistakable shadow of a man, tall and deliberate in his movements. This time, he carried no lantern. Instead, a small gleam at his side suggested metal catching what little light there was. He approached the Arkwright grave with swift purpose, crouched and began working at the turf. The movement was quick, practiced. Nothing hesitant or experimental about it. After a few moments, There was a faint sound of scraping, as though something solid was being levered from the earth. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dark. "He's after something buried with the coffin," Holmes whispered. The figure straightened briefly, glancing about, and in that instant I caught the pale oval of his face. It was not Leonard Arkwright. Before I could whisper this to Holmes, the man bent again and produced from the soil a narrow, oblong parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He tucked it under his arm and began to move toward the hedgerow. Holmes touched my arm. "Let him get past the gap. We'll take him in the lane, less noise." We moved quickly once he had disappeared through the opening, keeping to the shadows. But as we reached the lane, there came the sharp drumming of feet and the rapid retreat of a man running at full tilt. He had anticipated pursuit. "After him, Watson," Holmes called, and we gave chase. The lane twisted between high hedges, the mist thickening in places, making it difficult to judge distance. The runner was quick, but burdened by the parcel, and twice he stumbled on the uneven ground. We gained on him steadily until, at the bend leading toward the vicarage, he veered suddenly into a narrow side path. Holmes was on him in 3 strides. There was a brief struggle, the sound of tearing cloth, and then the man wrenched free, minus the parcel which Holmes had wrested from his grasp. He vanished into the darkness beyond the hedge before either of us could recover enough to follow. Holmes stood, breathing hard but triumphant, the oilcloth bundle in his hands. "We have what he came for, Watson," he said, "and he will know it. That may prove more useful than his immediate capture." We returned to the inn, where in the privacy of our sitting room Holmes laid the bundle on the table. With care, he unwrapped it, revealing a small wooden chest, its surface darkened with age and its lid secured by a rusted clasp. Inside, cushioned by yellowed linen, lay a bundle of letters tied with fraying ribbon, and beneath them a flat packet wrapped in oilskin. Holmes untied the ribbon and glanced over one of the letters, his brows lifting slightly. "Correspondence from Mr. Arkwright's time in Burma, seemingly mundane on the surface, but several refer obliquely to the ledger and the debt unpaid." He set the letters aside and unwrapped the oilskin packet. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, covered in neat but faded handwriting. Holmes read it in silence, his face expressionless. At last he folded it carefully and returned it to its wrapping. "This, Watson, is the heart of the matter. It is no wonder someone wished it buried, both literally and figuratively. But before we speak of it, we must draw our quarry into the open and force him to claim it. Mr. Holmes, Mr. Leonard asked me to inform you that Inspector Lestrade intends to search the lodge this afternoon. He thought you might wish to be present." Holmes inclined his head. "My compliments to Mr. Leonard, I shall certainly attend. And Chalmers, be so good as to pass word to Mrs. Doran that the grave will be fully restored by this evening. The Reverend is keen to ensure all traces of disturbance are erased." Chalmers bowed and withdrew, but not before Holmes's gaze lingered on him in that unreadable way he has when he has noticed something amiss. When the door had closed, Holmes said quietly, "Did you note, Watson, how the butler's eyes went to the chest before anything else? Not in idle curiosity but in recognition. He knows what it is. You think he might be involved?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that the man who serves a household for decades sees more than any family member realizes. Chalmers's role here may be more active than mere observation." That afternoon we accompanied Lestrade to Hawthorne Lodge. The inspector, brimming with confidence after Leonard's arrest, approached the search as though expecting to unearth the stolen tin box and letters on the spot. He began with the study, rifling drawers, peering behind books and directing constables to examine cupboards. Holmes, meanwhile, seemed far more interested in the garden side of the house. He disappeared for a quarter of an hour and returned with soil on his gloves and a thin smile. "Nothing?" Lestrade asked, half triumphant. "Nothing of yours, Lestrade," Holmes said evenly. "But I have found where our nocturnal visitor hid the remainder of his apparatus." He produced from under his coat a second section of metal tubing, its joinery identical to the piece we had recovered earlier. Lestrade looked unimpressed, but I could see in Holmes's eyes that the find was another piece in the puzzle he was quietly assembling. By the time we returned to the inn, the autumn light was fading, and the mists had begun to gather low over the fields. Holmes stood at the window watching the lane. "Tonight, Watson, our quarry must act or abandon the game. If he believes the chest is here, and that it contains what I suspect it does, he will not wait another day." He turned from the window, his expression sharpening. "The motive, my dear Watson, is becoming clear. This is not about desecrating a grave for its own sake, nor about frightening villagers with ghostly sounds. It is about silencing the past, a past that could ruin a man still living under another name. The chest was buried with Arkwright because it was safer underground than in any locked drawer. And now that it is above ground, I said, it is dangerous to the man it incriminates. Exactly, Holmes replied. Which is why he will try to take it from us before it reaches the hands of the law, or of anyone who might use it against him. And when he comes, Watson, we shall be waiting. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. By early evening, the last pale streaks of daylight had surrendered to a thick, windless dark. The lamps in our small sitting room at the inn cast a warm glow upon the table, where the chest sat in deliberate prominence. Holmes had arranged it so that anyone glancing through the thin lace curtains would see it plainly, as if we had foolishly left our prize exposed. Watson, Holmes said, leaning back in his chair, the strength of a trap lies in its plausibility. We must make it seem as though the chest is in our possession carelessly, under only the most perfunctory guard. Our adversary must feel the theft is possible, perhaps even easy. And in reality? I asked. In reality he will find the difficulty lies not in entering but in leaving. Holmes's eyes glinted as he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small brass whistle attached to a length of cord. One sharp blast will be your signal to the constable posted in the lane. He will come at once by the rear entrance. He glanced at the clock, 9:30. Now we wait. The hours passed in taut stillness, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. Holmes sat as motionless as a carved figure, save for the slow revolutions of his pocket watch chain between forefinger and thumb. My own nerves were less steady. I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the window, listening for any irregularity in the night sounds outside. It was just past 11 when Holmes raised a hand, head tilted slightly. Footsteps, he murmured. Light, deliberate, coming from the garden side. I heard them too, a faint crunch of gravel, then the almost imperceptible squeak of the gate hinge. A shadow darkened the curtain, paused, then moved toward the door. There was no knock. Instead, the latch turned with practiced silence. The door opened a fraction, admitting a thin blade of night air. A figure slipped through, tall, lean, wearing dark clothing and gloves. His eyes went straight to the chest. In 2 swift strides, he was beside the table, his hands already on the clasp. Holmes did not move. The intruder opened the lid, revealing nothing but a bundle of old newspaper tied with string. He froze, realizing the deception, and in that instant Holmes was upon him. The man fought like one who knew capture meant ruin, striking, twisting, lunging toward the window. I stepped in to block his escape and Holmes, with a movement as precise as it was forceful, brought him to the floor. Watson, the whistle, Holmes ordered. I blew a single piercing note, and within seconds the constable burst in from the lane entrance. Together we secured the prisoner, who glared up at us with a face pale under the lamplight. It was Chalmers, the Arkwright butler. Holmes regarded him with a detached curiosity, as though examining an unfamiliar specimen. You have been most industrious, Chalmers, he said. Grave disturbance, housebreaking, and now burglary from your employer's guests. Quite a repertoire. Chalmers's lips twisted. You've no proof of anything beyond tonight. On the contrary, Holmes replied. I have the button torn from your coat at the grave 2 nights ago, the coupling from the tubing you hid in the garden shed, and the fresh impressions of your narrow-soled boots by the ivy-covered gate. More than enough to place you at the scene of each nocturnal visit. The butler's defiance faltered. I was only... Holmes raised a hand. Spare me the improvisation. You were retrieving something buried with Mr. Arkwright, something dangerous to a man whose past you served more closely than anyone realized. You are not the principal in this matter, Chalmers, but the instrument. Your employer is the man once known as Archibald Merton Dyer. Chalmers's eyes flickered in panic before he could control it. Holmes pressed on. You assisted him abroad, did you not? Helped him conceal certain funds, perhaps even shared in them. When Arkwright returned to England with proof in that chest, you were sent to ensure it never surfaced. First by creating a haunted grave to keep idle villagers away, then when that failed by stealing it outright. But you failed again. Last night, in fact, when you were intercepted. The constable took hold of Chalmers's arm. Holmes turned to him. Keep him under guard until morning. There is one more act to this play, and our true lead must yet step onto the stage. When Chalmers had been marched out, I asked, Holmes, if Chalmers is not the mastermind, why act tonight? Surely his employer would prefer to act himself. Not if the employer is a man with a public position to guard, Holmes replied. Dyer, under whatever name he now uses, will keep himself insulated until the last possible moment. But with Chalmers in custody and the chest still at large, he will have no choice but to act personally, or lose everything. That is when we will take him. He replaced the bundle of newspapers in the chest and closed the lid. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall arrange a more conspicuous display of our treasure. It is time the spider realized the fly has not been caught, but waits, very patiently, at the center of its own web. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The morning broke damp and colorless, the sky a low lid of pewter pressing upon the village. From our window at the inn, I could see villagers already in small knots, their heads close together, whispering. News of Chalmers's arrest had traveled, and with it a renewed curiosity about the strange events surrounding the Arkwright grave. Holmes was at the table, sipping coffee and scanning the neat columns of the Times. He set it down with a faint smile. Dyer, he said without preamble, has taken the bait. I looked up from buttering my toast. You've heard from him? Not directly. But consider, our display of the chest last night, the arrest of his servant, and the fact that the constable has made a point of hinting the chest's contents will be delivered to Lestrade by this evening. A man in his position could no more ignore that than a drowning man could refuse a rope. Holmes drew from his pocket a folded note, the paper thick and cream-colored, the hand that of a practiced correspondent. This was delivered not 10 minutes ago by a boy who claims to have been paid $1 to bring it to me without delay. Listen. Mr. Holmes, I understand you are in possession of certain papers and effects belonging to my late friend, Mr. Nathaniel Arkwright. As these may contain private family matters, I would be obliged if you could meet me at the vicarage at 2 o'clock to discuss their return. Discretion is of the utmost importance. Yours faithfully, Leonard Arkwright. Holmes tapped the signature. Leonard Arkwright is of course the name he wears here, but the phrasing, Watson, the deliberate emphasis on discretion, this is Dyer's hand in more than one sense. You mean to confront him at the vicarage? I mean to allow him to attempt whatever scheme he has prepared. But it must be on ground of my choosing. Holmes rose, pacing to the window. The vicarage is a curious choice, neutral territory yet close enough to the churchyard to permit certain movements. Dyer will not come alone. He will have some plan for removing the chest without my consent, either through persuasion, trickery, or force. I set down my cup. Then we must be prepared for all three. Holmes nodded. Precisely. You and I will go to the vicarage with the chest, containing only the newspapers of course. Lestrade will be posted with 2 constables in the vestry of the church, which adjoins the vicarage garden. At my signal they will enter. The hours until 2 o'clock seemed to crawl, each tick of the clock a reminder of the coming confrontation. When at last we set out, the chest, light in my hands without its true contents, was draped in a plain blanket, as though to shield it from idle curiosity. The Reverend Fortescue greeted us at the door of the vicarage with his usual mild dignity, though I sensed a certain stiffness in his manner. Mr. Arkwright is already in the study, he said. He seemed anxious to begin your discussion. Holmes smiled faintly. Anxiety is a symptom that often accompanies guilt, Reverend. May we? We found Leonard Dyer standing by the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression the picture of polite reserve. He glanced at the chest as we entered, and though his face betrayed nothing, I saw the faintest tightening about the eyes. Mr. Holmes, he began, you have something that belongs to me. I have something that belonged to the late Mr. Arkwright, Holmes corrected. Whether it belongs to you is precisely the question before us. Dyer's tone cooled. You are a man of the world. Surely you understand that certain documents, taken out of context, can do needless harm. Or, Holmes said evenly, they may do necessary harm to a man who has taken great pains to bury his past. A flicker passed over Dyer's features, gone as quickly as it came. I am prepared to compensate you for the trouble you have taken. Handsomely. Holmes's voice was mild, but I caught the steely undertone. I fear the worth of what I hold cannot be measured in currency. Still, I am curious, what value do you set upon these old letters? Dyer took a step closer. Enough to see them vanish forever. Enough to. Whatever he intended to say was cut short by a sudden movement. The door behind me swung inward, and another man stepped into the room, broad-shouldered, with the look of a tradesman. He carried a heavy walking stick and positioned himself between us and the door. Holmes did not even glance at him. And here is your second card, Dyer. Intimidation in case persuasion failed. The butler's absence had forced Dyer to employ new hands, yet the clumsiness of the tactic only confirmed Holmes's earlier deductions. Dyer moved toward the chest, but Holmes's hand came up sharply. Not yet, Holmes said. There is a third card to be played. He gave me the smallest nod and I reached for the whistle in my pocket. One piercing note cut through the air. The study door burst open to admit Lestrade and two constables. The broad-shouldered man's stick clattered to the floor as he found himself grasped by both arms. Dyer stepped back, his composure cracking. "You have no proof," he began. Holmes's voice was quiet but carried the weight of certainty. "On the contrary, I have proof enough to satisfy any court. The original contents of that chest, now safely in official custody, include a signed confession by Archibald Merton Dyer, detailing the misappropriation of colonial funds, the laundering of those sums through fictitious accounts, and the subsequent concealment of the records. They also include correspondence with your agent, Chalmers, arranging for their burial with Mr. Arkwright. Shall I continue?" For the first time, Dyer's poise deserted him entirely. He glanced from Holmes to Lestrade, then to the chest as though calculating and discarding some last avenue of escape. Lestrade stepped forward. "Leonard Arkwright or Dyer or whatever name you choose, you'll come with me." Holmes closed the lid of the chest with a decisive click. And thus, Watson, the beating heart of the grave is stilled, not by exorcism but by exposure. As we left the vicarage, I could not help but glance toward the churchyard, where the yews swayed gently in the damp breeze. The grave of Nathaniel Arkwright lay quiet once more, its brief notoriety already fading into the deeper silence of the stones. Holmes, however, walked on without a backward glance. "Elementary," he murmured, but with just enough theater to keep the audience in their seats until the final act. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The rain had begun by the time we left the vicarage, a steady, cold drizzle that blurred the glow of the street lamps and slicked the cobblestones underfoot. Lestrade marched Dyer between the two constables toward the waiting trap outside, the prisoner's head bowed but his eyes flicking left and right in quick, measuring glances. I recognized that look. Holmes had once described it as the ferret's search for a hole. We reached the lane where the trap stood, its oil lamps hissing faintly in the wet. As Lestrade stepped forward to help Dyer into the carriage, the prisoner seemed to stumble. In the same instant, his elbow shot backward into the inspector's ribs. Lestrade grunted, lost his grip, and Dyer lunged sideways into the darkness, shoving past one constable and vanishing toward the churchyard wall. "After him!" Lestrade barked, doubling over for a second before giving chase. Holmes was already moving. "This way, Watson. He'll head for the gap in the hedge by the far corner." We sprinted down the lane, cutting across a muddy verge toward the shadowed bulk of the church. The drizzle stung my eyes, but ahead I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure slipping through the ivy where the wall had crumbled. Holmes plunged after him without hesitation, and I followed into the dim maze of leaning stones and rain-slicked turf. Dyer was quick for a man of his years, weaving between the graves with the desperate agility of one who knows the penalty for failure. Twice he glanced back, his face a pale blur in the gloom, before veering toward the gate behind the sexton's cottage. Beyond lay the open fields and, eventually, the London road. "Cut him off at the yews," Holmes called. I angled right, my boots sliding in the wet grass, and managed to intercept him just as he reached the narrow path. Dyer swerved, colliding with me shoulder first, and I staggered. Before I could recover, Holmes was upon him. It was no gentleman's wrestling match this time. Dyer fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his hands clawing at Holmes's coat, his knee driving upward. Holmes turned the blow, seized his wrist and twisted. The cry that escaped Dyer's lips was half rage, half pain. Lestrade and the constables arrived in a rush, lanterns flaring against the wet dark. "Hold him fast." Lestrade snapped, and between us we had Dyer's arms pinioned and his feet braced. The constables clamped iron cuffs on his wrists, their chains clinking like a final verdict. Holmes stepped back, breathing hard but composed, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Your agility is remarkable, Dyer," he said evenly. "A pity it could not outrun your own history." Dyer's eyes glittered in the lantern light. "You think you've won, Holmes? But there are others who know, others who will see that paper never reaches the courts." Holmes's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. "The papers are already in secure hands. Even if I were struck down this very night, they would be in Lestrade's possession by morning, and in the hands of the Crown before week's end. Your conspiracy, like your ghost in the grave, cannot survive daylight." With that, Lestrade gestured to the constables. "Get him into the trap. And mind his elbows this time." As they led Dyer away, the rain slackened, leaving the churchyard in a hush broken only by the patter from the yew branches. Holmes stood for a moment, looking down at the disturbed earth where Dyer had slipped in his flight. Fitting, he murmured, that he should try to vanish through the same gap by which he tried to deceive an entire village. We returned to the inn by way of the green, where a few lingering lamps burned behind curtained windows. The air smelled of damp stone and wood smoke. Holmes said little until we were inside and the door was bolted. Then he removed his coat and seated himself by the fire. "You see, Watson," he said, "the man's every move followed the same principle as his initial crime: concealment by diversion. He believed that if he could keep all eyes fixed on the grave, no one would think to watch the living man who benefited from its disturbance. Even his escape attempt tonight was a miniature of the same scheme: a stumble to draw the eye, a sudden lunge toward the shadows. I settled opposite him, the warmth of the hearth driving the chill from my hands. And yet, for all his cunning, it was the smallest of clues that undid him." Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, the button, the coupling, the footprints by the ivy gate. Each by itself insignificant, but together they formed a line as direct as the path we ran tonight. The challenge lay in ensuring he revealed himself fully before we closed the net." Lestrade appeared not long after, a little damp but in high spirits. "We've got him under lock and key now," he reported. "And the Yard will be glad enough to have the papers in the morning. Though I'll admit, Holmes, this one had me chasing in all the wrong directions at the start." Holmes smiled faintly. "A red herring is best when it is fresh, Lestrade, and you pursued yours with admirable zeal. In doing so, you helped me make our friend believe his plan was still on course." When Lestrade had gone, Holmes leaned back, folding his long fingers together. "It will be some days before the formal charges are laid and the past of Archibald Merton Dyer is read aloud in court. By then, the villagers will have reduced this matter to a fireside tale, a grave that beat like a heart and the men who came to lay it still. And so the fiction will outlive the truth as it so often does." I could not help but smile. "But you will have the truth recorded, Holmes?" His eyes half closed in the firelight. "Naturally, my dear Watson. And you will see that it is written with your customary precision. Now," he reached for his pipe, "let us have no more of graves, beating hearts, or men who mistake shadows for sanctuary. The game in this instance is well and truly over." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. The morning after Dyer's capture dawned with a pale, wintry clarity. The rain had scoured the sky clean, leaving it a thin blue streaked with high, cold clouds. Lestrade departed early with the prisoner in tow, a constable on either side of the trap. From the inn window we watched the small procession rattle out of the village and turn toward the London road. Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his lean figure outlined against the light. It is a rare thing, Watson, to close a case in which the central clue was buried in every sense of the word. One could almost be poetic about it. I smiled over my coffee. "You've kept the full pattern close to your chest. I think you owe me an account, Holmes. Not just the facts, but how each led you from a whisper in a graveyard to a man's true name and history." Holmes turned, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Very well. Let us begin at the start, the vicar's story. A grave recently filled, a withered rose standing upright, and a beating sound reported by the sexton. Now, a grave does not disturb itself. Either someone had been there after the burial, or the earth had settled in an unusual way. The rose, however, was key. It was an intentional marker. Someone wished to draw attention to that particular spot, but in a manner that would excite curiosity rather than alarm outright. And the heartbeat? A simple matter of acoustics, Holmes said, seating himself across from me. The sound was created by striking a hollow tube or rod that reached into the coffin space. When the blow was delivered at the far end, the earth muffled it into something uncanny. Our intruder, you will recall, repeated the act even on a night when no villagers were present, proving it was not merely a spectacle for the crowd. It was a signal, Watson, or a tool for reassurance, confirming to himself that the hiding place remained undisturbed. I nodded. "And you found the coupling that suggested the rest of the apparatus?" "Precisely. That, together with the groove in the soil and the different compaction at front and rear, told me there had been repeated, deliberate access, enough to remove or place an object. The grave was not the objective itself, it was the container." Holmes reached for his cigarette case, tapping it lightly. The next step was to identify who had both motive and opportunity. Leonard Arkwright was too obvious a suspect for my liking, though Lestrade was quick to pounce. The maid's sighting of a lantern leaving the lodge, combined with the open gardener's shed and missing piping, gave me the first true lead. That trail led directly to Chalmers, whose narrow-soled prints matched those by the ivy gate. And yet Chalmers was only the agent. Just so. His loyalty was to his employer, Dyer, who had lived comfortably under an assumed name. I suspected Dyer's identity once I read the letters from Burma, with their repeated references to the ledger and the debt unpaid. Archibald Merton Dyer was a name long absent from public record, but his past in the colonial service and the scandal that ended it were matters I had not forgotten. The correspondence hinted that Arkwright had knowledge, perhaps even proof, of Dyer's crimes. Such proof would be dangerous in the wrong hands, so when Arkwright died, Dyer's best course was to bury it with him. I leaned forward. The chest then was the true prize. Indeed. Buried with the coffin, secure from casual discovery, and warded by superstition. But after some months, Chalmers, acting under Dyer's orders, returned to ensure it was safe, staging the haunting, to deter intrusion. My presence, however, altered their timetable. The staged heartbeat had to be repeated to maintain the illusion, even as Dyer arranged the theft from the lodge to retrieve whatever duplicate papers Arkwright might have kept. And the oilskin packet? Holmes smiled thinly. A signed confession by Dyer, prepared years ago as part of a coercion between the two men, along with banking records that tie the misappropriated funds to Dyer's current investments. Arkwright must have intended to use them if the old grudge ever needed settling. Death forestalled that, but the documents were entombed with him, until Chalmers was sent to recover them. He lit a cigarette, exhaling thoughtfully. Once Chalmers failed, Dyer was forced into direct action. His invitation to the vicarage was the final neutral ground where he could attempt bribery, intimidation, or outright theft without the risk of being caught at his own premises. The arrival of his hired muscle only confirmed it. I allowed him to think the chest was still unguarded in order to draw that attempt into the open. I considered the matter in silence for a moment. And his escape attempt last night? Holmes's lips quirked. Merely the last card in a pack he had been playing since the first disturbance. But by then, Watson, the game was already lost. Once the documents were in Lestrade's custody, all that remained was to ensure Dyer revealed himself fully before witnesses. We sat quietly for a while, the case laid bare between us like the map of a campaign just won. Outside, the village went about its morning business, unaware of the deeper currents that had run beneath its quiet surface for weeks. Holmes rose at last and took up his coat. You see, Watson, a beating heart in a grave is nothing but a trick of sound and the imagination. Yet it can be enough to set the whole machinery of truth in motion, if one listens closely. That is the essence of detection, to hear the signal beneath the noise. With that, he stepped out into the crisp air, the smoke from his cigarette drifting behind him like the last wisp of mystery dissipating into the day. Chapter 15, The Final Gathering. It was Holmes's suggestion, delivered with that quiet finality which brooked no debate, that we assemble all the principal figures of the affair before leaving Chislehurst. Loose ends, Watson, are like unsecured doors, he said that morning. They invite drafts and, worse, the possibility of someone slipping back inside. By noon, the vestry of St. Stephen's had been prepared for the meeting. The Reverend Fortescue agreed to lend the space, perhaps seeing in the gathering an opportunity to close the chapter without lingering whispers. The long oak table was set with a modest spread of tea and bread, though I suspected few would touch it. One by one the parties arrived. Leonard Arkwright, or rather the man who had borne that name until the day before, was absent, of course, now under lock and key in London. But Chalmers, released into Lestrade's guarded custody for the occasion, was brought in with an expression carefully balanced between defiance and resignation. Mrs. Doran, the housekeeper, took a seat near the end of the table, her hands folded tight over one another. Henry the gardener lounged uncomfortably on a bench by the wall, as though uncertain whether he had been summoned for reprimand or thanks. Alice, the maid, sat beside him, wide-eyed but determined to follow every word. Lestrade, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looked more at home than any of them. "Right, Holmes," he said, "you've got them all here. Let's hear the grand unveiling." Holmes stood at the head of the table, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the polished wood. He began without preamble. "The matter," he said, "concerned not a supernatural visitation as some feared, but a calculated deception to mask a theft, both past and present. When Mr. Nathaniel Arkwright died, he was buried with a chest containing documents dangerous to one man, Archibald Merton Dyer, known in this village as Leonard Arkwright." A ripple went around the table at the name. Alice's eyes darted toward Mrs. Doran, who kept her gaze fixed on her folded hands. "Dyer," Holmes continued, "was a disgraced colonial official who many years ago misappropriated funds entrusted to him. Mr. Arkwright, a former associate, had acquired proof of his crimes, proof which could have led to prosecution even after all this time. The safest place for such incriminating material was, in Arkwright's view, beneath the earth. Thus, the chest was buried with him. He paced slowly, his keen gaze moving from face to face. But Dyer could not let it lie. He employed his butler, Chalmers, to retrieve the chest under cover of night. To keep curious eyes away from the grave, they staged an elaborate ruse, the so-called heartbeat, produced by striking a hollow tube into the coffin space from a concealed point. The withered rose was placed upright in the soil as a macabre token, intended to deepen the unease. Chalmers shifted in his chair but said nothing. Holmes went on. When the deception was reported, it gave Dyer an additional advantage. Suspicion would fall elsewhere. Lestrade, in his enthusiasm, was led to believe the sexton Barnes bore the guilt. Meanwhile, Chalmers could move more freely. But our maid here, he inclined his head toward Alice, observed a lantern leaving the lodge on one of those nights. That lantern and the open gardener's shed with missing piping provided the link to the apparatus used at the grave. Holmes paused, his voice sharpening. From there the trail was straightforward. A button torn from Chalmers's coat at the grave, the coupling for the tubing found near the hedge, and the distinctive footprints by the ivy gate, all placed him on the scene. The theft from the lodge, in which letters and a tin box were taken, was the second act in the scheme. The third was Dyer's personal attempt to recover the chest from me at the vicarage, an attempt that ended with his arrest. Mrs. Doran stirred at last. And what of the chest now? In safe hands, Holmes said. The original documents have been conveyed to the authorities. Dyer's confession and the supporting bank records will form the basis of the charges against him. As for the letters of a more personal nature, they will be returned to Mr. Arkwright's estate, where they belong. Lestrade straightened. That about wraps it up, then. But I've got to hand it to you, Holmes. You turned what looked like a village ghost story into a tidy criminal case. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. The ghost was never in the grave, Lestrade. It walked among the living, clothed in a false name and a careful manner. Once we saw that, the rest was a matter of following the faintest of trails, each small in itself, but together forming an unbroken line. Reverend Fortescue, who had listened in grave silence, now rose. If nothing else, he said, this will serve to remind us that the truth, however uncomfortable, is always preferable to the fictions we spin to avoid it. Holmes inclined his head. Well said, Reverend. And now I suggest we allow the matter to rest. The dead man may sleep in peace, and the living can see to their consciences, or their sentences, as the law directs. The gathering dispersed slowly, the villagers leaving in subdued pairs. Chalmers was led out between the constables, his head bowed. Alice lingered for a moment to thank Holmes in a small, earnest voice, while Mrs. Doran kept her distance, her face unreadable. When we stepped outside, the winter light was already fading, casting the churchyard in long, cold shadows. The grave of Nathaniel Arkwright lay quiet, the turf smoothed, the rose gone. Only the yews stirred faintly in the breeze, their whispering branches sounding, to my mind, like a long breath finally released. Holmes glanced at me as we turned toward the lane. The theater is concluded, Watson, the curtain fallen. But I suspect this performance will be retold here for years, though as ever the villagers will embellish the plot beyond recognition. I smiled. Then perhaps it's best that one account, yours, remains untarnished. He shook his head. Yours, Watson. I merely supply the details. You are the chronicler. And with that, we left the churchyard behind, the last echoes of the grave's phantom heartbeat fading into the silence of the winter evening. Resigned and vanished from public record, taking the proceeds with him. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and measured. Nathaniel Arkwright was at that time a contemporary of Dyer's in the colonial service. Whether from loyalty, prudence, or design, he returned to England with documents, bank records, letters, and a signed statement from Dyer that could, if brought to light, have ended Dyer's freedom. He kept them hidden for years, and it is my belief that he used their existence to hold Dyer at a certain distance, if not entirely at his mercy. It was a sword of Damocles hanging over the man's head. I nodded. And when Arkwright died, the sword remained. Exactly. Dyer could not simply seize the papers during Arkwright's life. The risk of exposure was too great. But in death, Arkwright created an opportunity. Whether he intended to protect Dyer or to ensure the documents remained undiscovered, he arranged for them to be placed in a chest and buried with him. The key point is that only a handful of people, Dyer, Chalmers, and perhaps one or two others, knew of their burial. Holmes tapped his cigarette ash into the grate. Chalmers, a man whose loyalty to Dyer was bought years before, was tasked with retrieving the chest. The grave, however, lay in a public churchyard. To keep it undisturbed until he could act, Chalmers concocted, or was instructed to concoct, the haunting. The withered rose planted in the disturbed soil, combined with the muffled heartbeat, was an inspired piece of rural theater. Fear would deter casual onlookers, and suspicion, if it arose, could be directed at the superstitious or the foolish. And the heartbeat, I said, was created with the metal tubing you recovered. Holmes inclined his head. Sections of piping joined by couplings, like those missing from the gardener's shed. One end was driven into the earth to the coffin space. The other, some yards away, could be struck with a stick to produce the sound. It was a crude but effective device. Barnes the sexton heard it and, being an honest man, reported it to the vicar. That was the first act of the play. Holmes rose and paced to the window, speaking over his shoulder. The second act came when I arrived and began to look more closely at the grave. Chalmers knew that if I kept watching the site, his access to it would be curtailed. So Dyer adjusted the plan. While we and Lestrade chased the phantom in the churchyard, Chalmers broke into Hawthorne Lodge to remove whatever additional papers or duplicates Arkwright might have kept in his study. That theft was the turning point. It told me the grave was not the true objective, but rather a cover for removing or protecting something of greater value. And that was when you began to suspect Dyer's identity? I asked. Yes. The letters from Burma, which Chalmers had failed to remove before my arrival, contained the telltale phrases, the ledger, the debt unpaid. I recalled Dyer's disgrace and pieced the connection together. Once his identity was clear, his motive became transparent: retrieve the chest, destroy its contents, and preserve his assumed life as Leonard Arkwright. Holmes returned to his chair. Our night watches proved Chalmers's presence at the grave, and the physical evidence, button, footprint, coupling, completed the chain. But to secure Dyer himself, I had to provoke a direct move. Chalmers's arrest forced his hand, and his invitation to the vicarage was the final gambit. There he intended to recover the chest through bribery or intimidation, confident that the law could not connect him to the nocturnal disturbances. I smiled faintly. Only to find the chest contained nothing but newspaper. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Quite. By then the real contents were in Lestrade's keeping, beyond Dyer's reach. His desperate escape attempt was merely the final flourish of a man who saw every line of retreat closing before him. For a moment, the only sound was the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. Holmes's gaze went distant, as though seeing not the dim lamplight of our room, but the fog-bound graveyard, the crouched figure at the head of the Arkwright plot, the thin trail of signs that had led him to the truth. It is worth noting, Watson, he said at last, that the entire edifice of deception depended on the villagers' willingness to believe in something inexplicable. A sound in the night, a flower standing where it should not, it was enough to fix their minds on the supernatural and away from the human hand. That is why such cases fascinate me. They reveal not only the mind of the criminal, but the minds of those he manipulates. He stubbed out his cigarette and reached for his violin, plucking the strings idly. You may write it as you will, the grave with a beating heart. Just remember, my dear fellow, that the heart was never in the coffin. It was in the mind of the man who feared what lay buried there. I closed my notebook, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and admiration that always followed the unraveling of one of Holmes's intricate puzzles. Outside, the village was settling into its nocturnal quiet, and somewhere in the darkness the church bell tolled the hour. The grave in St. Stephen's would lie undisturbed now, its secrets laid bare, its phantom heartbeat silenced forever. Holmes played a low, thoughtful chord and looked toward the fire. Elementary, he murmured, and the music rose, soft and certain, carrying the case to its final rest. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. A week later found us in London, the grey winter light slanting across Baker Street as the rumble of carriages passed below. I had not expected to hear much more of the Chislehurst affair so soon, yet that morning's post brought a neat envelope addressed in Inspector Lestrade's cramped hand. Holmes broke the seal with the languid air of a man reading an already known outcome, while I leaned forward, curious. It seems, Watson, he said after scanning the page, that Archibald Merton Dyer has faced his first examination at Bow Street. The magistrate has remanded him for trial on charges of fraud, misappropriation of colonial funds, and obstruction of justice. The evidence from the chest is deemed sufficient to proceed without delay. And Chalmers? I asked. Also remanded, though on lesser charges, housebreaking and accessory to fraud. His cooperation with the authorities, such as it is, may earn him a more lenient sentence. Lestrade notes, however, that the man's loyalty to Dyer was of a sort that defies reason, which I interpret as meaning he still clings to a misplaced sense of fealty. Holmes laid the letter aside and reached for his pipe. Justice Watson moves at a pace too slow for my taste, but in this instance, it is at least moving in the correct direction. I reflected on the week that had passed since our return. The quiet of Baker Street felt doubly so after the mists and whispered gossip of Chislehurst. "Do you suppose," I said, "that the villagers understand the truth of what happened? Or will the tale remain one of a haunted grave?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A little of both, no doubt. Human nature prefers a good story to a dry fact. In the public mind, the heartbeat will remain, an embellishment to be repeated by firesides long after the name of Dyer is forgotten. The law, however, requires the facts, and those we have delivered." He rose and moved to the window, watching the traffic below. "Dyer's trial will be a matter of some interest. The Crown will present the confession and banking records, of course, but the more compelling piece will be the very simplicity of the graveyard deception. A length of tubing, a planted rose, and a village's willingness to believe, enough to cloak a crime for weeks. I dare say the jurors will be as struck by the psychology as by the paper evidence." There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with the afternoon papers. The Daily Telegraph had devoted half a column to the case, the headline reading, "Grave disturbances linked to colonial fraud, arrests made." Beneath was a concise account of the affair, stripped of the more fanciful rumors but still colored by phrases such as macabre deception and phantom heartbeat. Holmes scanned it quickly. "A tolerable account," he remarked, "though I note they omit the most important element. And that is, that the entire enterprise depended on timing, Watson. Chalmers's visits were spaced just far enough apart to maintain the illusion, and Dyer's appearance came only when he believed the danger of exposure outweighed the risk of acting. Had we arrived a week earlier, the chest might still have lain untouched. A week later, and it would have vanished entirely. In the days that followed, we received 2 further notes, one from Reverend Fortescue expressing gratitude for Holmes's intervention and reporting that the grave had been restored to its proper and undisturbed state. The other from Alice, the maid, thanking us in shy, halting words for making it safe to walk past the church again at night. Holmes read both with a mild but unmistakable satisfaction, though he would not admit as much aloud. On the morning of the trial, Lestrade sent word that our presence at the Old Bailey would be appreciated, particularly for Holmes to clarify certain points regarding the chain of evidence. We attended, and I observed Dyer closely as he stood in the dock, a tall, composed figure in a dark suit, his manner outwardly calm but with the faint stiffness of a man holding himself rigid against the tide. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision. The chest was produced, its contents laid out in careful order, the letters from Burma, the banking records, and at the center, Dyer's signed confession. The coupling and tubing were entered as exhibits, alongside the button and the photographs of footprints by the ivy gate. Holmes's testimony was delivered in his customary clear, unemotional style, outlining the sequence of deductions without flourish but with an authority that kept the court's attention fixed. When the defense attempted to suggest that the confession was forged, Holmes merely indicated the other exhibits. A forgery, however skillful, does not walk into a churchyard at night to recover itself, nor does it prompt the elaborate ruse we have documented here. Dyer's eyes met Holmes's once during the proceedings, a fleeting look in which I fancied I saw both admiration and resentment. By the trial's end, the verdict was inevitable, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 15 years penal servitude, was delivered without ceremony. Outside the court, Lestrade was in high spirits. "A clean finish, Holmes," he said, clapping my companion on the shoulder. "I'll admit I thought you were chasing shadows at first, but you've a way of making the shadows lead straight to the man." Holmes inclined his head. "Shadows, Lestrade, are merely the outlines cast by solid objects. Find the object, and the shadow explains itself." We returned to Baker Street that evening, the glow of the fire welcoming us back into its familiar warmth. I set my notes in order, knowing they would form the backbone of my account, while Holmes sat with his pipe, staring into the embers. "The law has its justice," he said at last, "and the village has its tale. Between them lies the truth, a grave with no heartbeat, and a man who could not escape the one his conscience provided." It struck me as I closed my notebook, that Holmes had given Dyer the one thing the man had spent years avoiding, a place in the public record. And in that, perhaps, lay the truest form of justice. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. The trial of Archibald Merton Dyer faded from the London papers within a fortnight, replaced by fresher scandals and more fashionable crimes. In Chislehurst, however, the tale lingered, reshaped and embroidered until it scarcely resembled the truth. By the time a month had passed, I heard from Reverend Fortescue that the grave of Nathaniel Arkwright had become a curious stopping place for visitors from neighboring villages, each eager to stand where the phantom heartbeat had once been heard. Holmes, as ever, showed little interest in such aftershocks. To him, the matter was closed the moment the last link in the chain of proof was secured. Yet I noticed that for several days after our return to Baker Street, he would take out the letters from Burma, now preserved with the rest of his private files, and turn them over thoughtfully in his long fingers before returning them to their envelope. One cold evening I found him thus occupied, the lamplight glinting on the paper's creases. Outside, the wind rattled the panes and drove the occasional hiss of sleet against the glass. I took my place by the fire, hoping to draw him into one of his rare reflective moods. "You have been thinking about Dyer?" I ventured. Holmes laid the letters aside. "Not about Dyer as such, Watson, but about the peculiar economy of deceit. The man spent years fabricating a respectable identity, cultivating the appearance of solidity, all while knowing that the truth lay 6 feet beneath a churchyard yew. In the end, it was not the law that found him, but his own need to protect the very thing that could destroy him." I smiled. "A heartbeat in a grave." He returned the smile faintly. "An illusion of life where none existed, created to deter others, yet powerful enough to draw him back to the scene until he stumbled into our net. You see, Watson, every criminal has his own rhythm. Once you learn to hear it beneath the noise, you can predict his next step as surely as if it were written in the score of a symphony." I leaned back, watching the smoke curl upward in lazy spirals. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "In a sense it is," Holmes said. "Given a man's character and his circumstances, the pattern of his actions follows with the same inevitability as the fall of a stone. What interests me is not merely catching him but understanding the architecture of the deceit, how it is built, how it functions, and, most importantly, how it collapses." For a while, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the faint roar of the fire. Then Holmes rose, took his violin from its place, and drew the bow across the strings in a soft, meditative phrase. The notes seemed to hang in the air like the last traces of mist over a winter field. "You will set it down, of course," he said without looking up. "The grave with a beating heart. Make it clear that the ghost was nothing but a man's fear of discovery, and that the man himself was undone by the very contrivance he thought would protect him. Leave the rest to the villagers, they will furnish the shadows to their liking." I promised I would. Holmes played on for some minutes, the melody slow and contemplative. At length he set the instrument aside, his gaze turning toward the window where the lamplight caught the blur of sleet against the glass. "There is another case brewing in Surrey," he said, his voice returning to its usual crispness. "Something about a locked library and an empty safe. If you are not otherwise engaged, Watson, we might take the morning train." And just like that, the matter of the Chislehurst grave was relegated to the shelves of Holmes's memory, filed among 100 other intrigues, another problem solved, another shadow dispelled. For my part, as I closed my notebook and banked the fire, I could still see in my mind the silent churchyard under the yews, the dark soil smoothed and unbroken, and hear, faintly, the echo of that phantom thudding, an echo now silenced forever by the one man who could turn a ghost into a name, and a name into justice.